my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so first in my speech today, I'm going to model how this message will be taught, and then I'm going to give some points about what this really brings upon these children and how it's going to benefit them in their life. So first, how would you be able to teach this? First, I think that would look like mentioning politics in, say, like lessons in school and reinforcing these like thought process through projects and lectures that like prioritize the idea of like questioning this type of stuff. And we also believe that it's gonna have a lot of teaching about like the political landscape of the world and like how to gauge how that works, because that gives you a lot of information like on this topic. And so what does this message teach kids to do? This teaches kids to think politically. And this is good because when it comes for their time to vote, which is going to be in the future, they can do a couple of things. For one, there's going to be more voter engagement within the younger group, and there's also going to be like better leaders chosen because of this voter engagement, where these people who have learned how to like gauge what good leaders are and what decisions are good, they now have the ability to vote and also vote the correct people in to represent their age group and other areas like that. And so what would this voter engagement mean like as a whole? Like within the younger community, this will mean that you will have leaders that are more catered to this community, which is very important because younger people are a less shown group in like voting and stuff like that. And it's also gonna show that these people have a good understanding, and so generally good leaders will be chosen like overall. Okay, so this does not mean that they would be doing stuff like questioning laws and such like that, as they would learn to judge these decisions and they would have a good idea about how these work. They will understand that some of these decisions are good, such as laws that have passed through Parliament and all have been good ideas, but if these are things that the younger population, which would be these people, would not like or go against, they would also learn to not be very afraid of like standing up for their community, standing up to do all this stuff. And a very low amount of these people will be thinking in a way to like question laws and stuff like this, so that would be a very marginal group.
Yeah. Why do I need to want to burn the system down and question authority just to be politically aware? Can't schools just teach people to read the news without them wanting to hate the system?
Well, this does not teach them to hate the system specifically. Instead, it teaches them to gauge whether a law or something is something that they should be hating and they should be being active against. Otherwise, we see a lot of low voter engagement, especially in younger groups that don't really think that this matters to them much as a whole. And even though doing stuff like reading newspapers and stuff like that would teach a lot about these kids, this also gives them incentive to do that stuff. They are learning to be more politically aware in these things like projects and lectures and stuff like that. So what is another thing that you gain by sending this message? These students are going to gain a lot of critical thinking. That's a very important thing for students to develop, because this teaches them how to appraise decisions and stuff like that, and that's very important. So what are the impacts of critical thinking in a student's life? One thing that they learn is how not to be submissive. So when someone tries to like enter your life and establish a leadership role, you can judge whether this person is going to be a good decision through these methods. And you can also appraise whether a decision that you are planning to make in the future is good or not. And this benefits their decision-making process because they can weigh those pros and cons. They understand what a good decision looks like and how it's going to matter in their day-to-day life. And so not being similarly connected, not being submissive is also helpful, because in life you have a lot of situations where people try to like establish leadership. There's a lot of situations where you need to establish leadership in situations like that, be it in like group projects or areas like that. And so not being submissive and speaking up for yourself is helpful in those situations as well, because you can establish leadership if you think that you are the best leader option. And there's also times where other people try to establish leadership, and you can see if those people are going to be a good decision overall to lead this group. And so what have I brought you today? I brought you a reason that being politically aware and stuff like that is good for these future voters and like establishing the political landscape, and how critical thinking is also good in these students' lives. So thank you.
I think that's the remarks. Invite the leader of opposition here. this is really small. If you're going to POI, just say it, because I'm probably not going to see it. The truth is, the best version of the government case requires people to question authority in a meaningful way and in a good way. We do not think that is the manifestation of questioning that is actually likely going to happen under these circumstances. But rather, we think the alternative is one where it becomes incredibly difficult to educate them about the important rules, and furthermore, it leads to them internally believing that the world is against them, that it is bad for societies in ways that change the way that people think and also what they buy into, which we think is incredibly bad. So, on opening opposition, we're going to do a couple of things. Firstly, I actually think Max's POI was sufficient in dealing with the education thing and symmetrizing it out of opening government, but we're going to do a little bit of setup explaining what the status quo looks like and why that level of questioning is already sufficient. Then we're going to run two arguments. The first on why it's harder to educate people and why education is so important, especially from a young age, and explaining why that leads into adulthood. And secondly, why this is bad for societies, both for individuals' perceptions of society and their fulfillment, but also in the way that they engage with societies that lead to worse results. Okay. Firstly, onto the setup on what we believe the world actually looks like. The truth is, right now, people do not get taught to question authority. And this is a truth. Maybe there's conversations about accountability, about people who are really, really bad and whether or not they should change. However, we don't get directly taught to question authority. And even if this does not happen, we think there are still manifestations of countercultural norms. So for example, in many places like universities with very free thought, we think there are many people who are against norms and against the societies that they live in. And the reality is, it's because people recognize that accountability is incredibly important. So for example, a manifestation of this was in the 1960s, there was a lot of countercultural norms, and that was as a result of the very conservative ideals that existed in the 1950s. So what this is to show is that the status quo is actually sufficient in allowing for the right amount of accountability to exist. Notably, even in very, for example, right-wing neighborhoods and right-wing communities, these phenomena occur in a sufficient way that actually reacts to those things. So for example, if it's a very, very right-wing society, then you have significantly more easier time gaining traction as a countercultural, for example, individual, being able to talk about these things because that state is so oppressive. Okay. First argument then on why it's harder to educate individuals. The thing here is that we think education is already very hard to teach, and furthermore that good education of questioning is very, very difficult to teach. We think the message gets convoluted in a way that doesn't actually lead to the end result that government likely wants to propose. This is for three reasons. The first, because we think kids just simplify the idea of questioning. This is an idea that is very difficult. It requires you to be precise and requires you to actually look at the different specificities of the thing that you're trying to question. For that to manifest in a good way requires individuals and children specifically to have the capacity to recognize what they should and what they should not question. We do not think they have this capacity, especially at a young age. Secondly, even if they're taught exactly and actually internalize what they should question, a lot of the times they cannot discern between right and wrong. And notably, this leads into adulthood in two ways. First of all, adults don't just all of a sudden have the best knowledge as a result of them being older. So we think you still need to pursue very high levels of education in order to understand what to question in terms of different topics. This can be in legal, for example, laws that are set, but also in terms of scientific fields as well. But the second is that we think this develops a habit of questioning authority in which they constantly do not want to recognize certain things that are talked about because they have this habit of constantly going against it. We think these are the different ways that leads into adulthood. But the last thing is that there are people who are rebellious, and when authority themselves, i.e. education, tells you to try to question authority, this actively pushes people away to become more questioning of authority than what is intended. This is why the manifestation of questioning is not likely going to be one that is good. Why is this really bad? The first, because education is really important for the for the life outcomes of an individual, and it's really already hard to convince kids of things like education, of why I should learn the quadratic formula when I don't want to go into math in the first place. No, thank you. So these are the different kinds of things that actually happen within the children's internal calculus, in which they no longer want to pursue things like education, even if it was good advice. Secondly, we think that respect is incredibly important because it gives you a defeatable presumption that you should listen to in the vast majority of the time. Here's why this is important, because we think that the rules set up by authority are generally reasonable and good rules that you should follow. Here's the thing, because these rules have gone through many levels of accountability and many systems of accountability, things like peer review in scientific papers and also different elections and accountability metrics within laws. So we think this is incredibly important in actually noticing that although a child or somebody who questions authority might not recognize this, these rules are still generally very important, and following them is something that is pretty good for a vast majority of different people. Second argument on why this is bad for society is really quickly, and Max will extend on this. So this argument occurs in two ways. The first, we don't think that most people are going to just obviously be completely rebellious and lead a bunch of countercultural movements. However, we think this makes people unhappy when they have the ideals of challenging authority. When they're constantly reminded that maybe authority is not correct, this makes them incredibly unhappy and look at things like policies very cynically. The second part is that it's really bad for society because people buy more into populist rhetoric and things like, for example, conspiracy theories. We're very proud to oppose.
And then next the remarks, called the DPM, which goes off the opening government venture here.
Okay, thank you. My time will begin in 3, 2, 1. Opposition wants you to believe that politics in the current status quo are good. They're perfect. The fact is that there's no need for a bunch of younger individuals to understand the importance of questioning. There's no need for these younger individuals to be educated individuals when it comes to politics as a whole. And there's no need for them to call out very important things when it comes to moving together as a society in the future. We believe that while their idea of politics currently in the status quo is something which we also want to believe on government, we believe this is inherently flawed. The fact is people are not being educated in a way that's beneficial for them to become learned members of the politics as a whole. And the fact is what I'm going to provide in this speech is specifically explaining why this is going to be extremely important in order to maximize the fact that people are going to be able to understand this message. I'm also going to be explaining to respond to the POI in some sort of way on the fact that it's not going to be this burning down the entire system thing, and even if it could take this sort of idea, it's likely going to be better than the alternative. But most importantly, I'm going to be explaining why it's just likely to have good education overall. So first of all, I want to provide some framing into what politics today looks like. We first want to make very clear that there's very low young voter engagement that exists in the status quo. We also want to say that there's a lack of calling out on very important issues that exist on like climate change and stuff. And the fact is, there's often just not good, there's perverse incentives that are coming from like governments that currently exist. For one of these reasons is like the inverse population pyramid that exists. It means that there's many more older individuals that are giving larger and larger parts of society as a whole, which are the ones who are more voting just more proportionally. So the fact is, if the individuals who are in like positions of power are not catering to younger individuals, they're not catering to the future, but they're instead catering to the older individuals who are consistently voting for them, and they're going to continue the problems that currently exist that have ruined the society in current ways, like climate change that exists. This is something that's inherently true when it comes to politics as a whole, and the fact is when we're trying to do this sort of motion, we're trying to figure out how we can break these old structures. So first, I want to talk about how the LO is already falling to this framing on their idea that respect is important. I want to explain that firstly, they claim that all these rules and stuff that exist are currently reasonable. We believe this is inherently flawed. First, on the idea that they say there's many systems like accountability metrics that currently exist. We say that it doesn't represent the younger individuals in enough way, and it also has a high likelihood of not catering to long-term future-based incentives, which we believe are very important when it comes to our society as a whole. They also do not explicitly explain why questioning in and of itself is bad. We believe that this is simply wrong. We say that questioning in and of itself is very beneficial insofar as it forces the individuals who are in power to answer the things and the reasons why they're making these sort of decisions and stuff. We believe if it is truly a good decision, then them being asked a lot of questions isn't going to be bad. It just means that the younger individuals are going to actually learn about the issues and why it happened in a certain way. The fact is, questioning in and of itself does not mean we're just going to disrespect authority. It means that we want reasons for why authority acts in specific ways, and the fact is education education and ability to understand these very basic things is the way that we can actually get more learned individuals. Next, I want to talk about this idea on how it's likely going to be, like this burn the system down idea is likely going to be extremely important when it comes to getting good politics. I want to say there's two main reasons why disrupt, even if it is disruptive, as opposition wants to claim, we're going to take their best case and our worst case here. We still say that extreme claims for a small minority of individuals is still going to allow a very baseline amount of change to be accessed. Kind of like this Overton window, when there's a specific amount of like push in one direction, there has to be some sort of middle ground reached. We say that even if it is slightly extremist insofar as younger voters want very specific concessions, we say that if this does occur, there's still going to be certain benefits which is accrued to these individuals that are likely going to be progressive for the benefit of society, because younger individuals have the least perverse incentives insofar as their future that they likely care most about, and they don't really care more about like specific short-term benefits. They likely care about the long-term ones because they want to be living in a positive society, which is likely going to cause us better policy and overall better politics overall. Next, on this idea of burning the system down, we say that burning the system down is likely going to be quite important when it to maximize education. We say that school is likely just not really interesting to a lot of individuals. There's a lot of young debaters here. They don't say that, oh, every day they're going to class, they're really learning from it. We say that when we have this sort of like burn the system down, it's quite different, it's novel. It means that there's an attraction that's created to these individuals, these students. Because the fact is that when a student sees something brand new, something that's challenging the system, something challenging something which they see in the dominant norms in society, we say that this is likely going to maximize the fact that they have interest in it. It means that they're going to spend more time because there's more interest in the way that where is this going, because they don't see that this is currently existing in the status quo. They want to see what's going to change as a result of this. So what does my partner provide to you? He provides you two main impacts as a result of this. We first say that we're going to just have better politics, and for the framing and other reasons which I've provided, it shows that we're just going to have a much better idea of questioning overall in the political system, and it's going to mean that younger voters are going to be more represented because they're just more likely to interact with politics as a whole, which means we're going to get better leaders but more representative leaders as a very important claim. But second of all, we just think that these skills are going to have much more application than just politics. They're just better for life as a whole. So how do we weigh over opposition? We weigh over opposition simply put on the fact that while they claim to have the questioning authority is bad, we've been able to flip all of these arguments and saying why specifically we're using all of their content to say, well, our side is going to be much better. This is why we are so proud to propose.
Any more speakers or remarks? We're going to get low and close out the top half of this debate. Here.
The most dangerous political movements that we have, which exist today, are movements built on disrespect for authority, on disrespect for science, disrespect for climate change, disrespect for vaccination, disrespect for the state on the basis that it's full of deep state hacks and bureaucrats. These are movements which seek to tear society down, which seek to impose a unilateral conception of what they believe to be true over the checks and balances which society have. If they get their political outcomes, and that's a big if, they are destructive outcomes, not positive grassroots movements. The two most powerful grassroots movements that we have seen that could be examples for government, the Black Lives Matter riots in 2020 and the Gaza protests today, are movements that have not succeeded at touching mainstream politics. There was not a significant change in policing in the United States after 2020. There is not a significant change in American foreign policy towards Israel now. Why? Because when you are countercultural and you protest, you are not speaking the language of the elite. You're calling them oppressors, genocidaires. You are not seeking to work with them. So at best, government could say that people challenge authority. They believe the system's illegitimate and the people involved with it are corrupted by that system. Do they build up an alternative? Because the burden in that argument is to say that children, people who are not sophisticated political consumers, but average voters and everyday people, believe and actually are better at knowing the truth than authority. Science is not perfect. Our political leaders aren't perfect, but they are generally subject matter experts in a way that the average person isn't. And imagine this in the classroom environment. We're talking about educating children, trying to get them to pay attention in math class, to listen during history class. Every other benefit of them understanding the world stems from them engaging and listening. When they are not taught to respect authority, you have to level with them to try to explain to a child why it matters that they learn this thing. What's the problem? Children have a limited amount of baseline knowledge. They haven't learned the concepts in math or in history, and so they struggle to actually understand and internalize the reasons that you provide to them as to why they ought to care. Perhaps they understand to a degree, but it's difficult to simply assert in the way that you would want with authority that you must listen, that you must quiet down, that you have to get your hands off that other student when they're in grade 2. And why does that matter? Because a rowdy classroom isn't a constructive learning environment. Children who aren't taught to have a defeatable presumption that they should listen to their teacher are just less likely to tune in, more likely to believe that they're justified in using their own judgment and tuning out, or saying that this doesn't seem important based on my preconceptions. And so perhaps we could reach that outcome of children being sophisticated and politically aware, but they need to learn first. And it's not clear that they're going to learn in the way that schools do right now, which rely, even if we don't ideally want it to rely on that way, but do rely on listening to teachers and treating them as authorities in the classroom. So that's the first part of the debate. The second part of the debate is about what happens to society. And I'm going to leave aside all the really important stuff that they don't seem to engage with, which is more children committing vandalism, putting graffiti everywhere, committing crimes because they believe that the state has failed and society's illegitimate. But that probably happens more too. I think the more important thing is what happens to their politics and their outlook on the world. I think that there are two main things. The first is that they become deeply cynical. Do you think the people who are standing on the University of Toronto campus right now protesting are happy? I don't. I think that these people are cynical. They have a worldview that's based on the idea that everything needs to be torn down, that everything they've been told by their professors, by their politicians, by their scientists, and by their leaders is wrong, corrupted, that society doesn't have their best interests in mind. And I'm willing to concede that sometimes they may well be right. Sometimes our societies may not have our best interests in mind. But in the majority of cases, in a country like Canada, I believe it does. And the problem with cynicism is it doesn't actually engage people in politics more. It may temporarily. They may go out and protest today. But will they maintain that tomorrow when nothing changes? When their particular ideology of the world doesn't happen? And when they consistently are given reasons to question authority and believe that that authority is legitimate? No. Those are people who become alienated. Now, on one end, that leads them to vote for populist charlatans like Marine Le Pen or Donald Trump. But on the second end, it also leads them to the left-wing side of that, to want to burn down the system, to want to riot. And those are not people who turn out to vote and engage in democratic politics. They yell, they're angry, but they're not people who are capable of engaging in constructive dialogue. A healthy respect for authority entails actually arguing with, deliberating, and debating with those authorities. Now I'll deal with the best argument from Gov, that society remains static and ossified, absent questioning authority. And I don't think this happens for two reasons. Number one, authorities are self-checking. In science, we have peer review. You can vote at the election if you don't like how the education system is being run. You can strike at your workplace. And remember, in our world, schools aren't teaching people to be countercultural, but the countercultural movement emerges not because they're told to be punk and told to be countercultural. It emerges because there is a culture. Every amount of counterculture and backlash is a reaction to a hegemonic society, and that exists as well. What's the implication? Many people protest in our world. We still have people in encampments, we still have some riots. We have less of them, sure. We have a sufficient amount to get the majority of their benefit. What they exclusively don't have is children who listen in school, people who have respect for their political system, respect for each other, and respect for their political society. We're very proud to oppose for that reason.